I think what's missing now from the old days is ideology. Thatcher had an ideology. You knew what she stood for because it sort of inhabited everything she said and she did. You knew exactly where you stood with her. Not so with the Cameron, May, Johnson Tories. They don't seem to have anything to believe in, which is why Brexit was so important to them, because it gave them a kind of something to get wound up about. And now that's happened. They're moving on to what we refer to as culture wars, as a way of banging the drum for their notion of the way society should be run. So that's really what's different to me. You can't. It's much harder to pin the current lot down. You know, they want to be loved. Thatcher never wanted to be loved.
Billy, what an honour. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here, mate. Thanks for having me on.
You look, I'd say, very sophisticated, actually. Very sophisticated look.
Oh, well, it's me kind of, this is my author look. You know, the last couple of years, I've written more books than I've made albums. So, and it's nice being an author because the festivals are a lot less muddy. You know,
it's true. There's a lot less muddiness involved. I have to say, I go a bit stir crazy just having to just stare at a screen all the time.
Yeah, but then, I understand. There's that. But I mean, doing the book festival circuit as opposed to the rock festival circuit, though, back in the old days when we could meet each other, you know, not having to have a sound check, not having to hump the gear in the rain up the back of the stage and deal with the grumpy road crew who've already been there 72 hours and they're all really, you know, it's the end of it's a terrible thing. If you're late on a Sunday night at a festival, it's like being the last person on the deck of the Titanic. It's like, you know, everyone's gone, like they've gone through it and come out the other side and they've had enough and they want to go home and you've got to do a show. It can be a bit hard. So literary festivals where you just turn up and just chat. Brilliant.
I know. I remember, although, of course, I'm thinking back. I remember when you invited me to Left Field in 2013, which does feel like a different universe.
Yeah. And
I was on the stage. I don't know what to think of this. I was on the stage. What a panel with Caroline Lucas and Tom Watson.
Far out. What a crew that was. Yeah, we've had some good mashups at Left Field. Sadly, not this year though.
No. How are you feeling? Before I ask you, that is a profound question, actually. Why am I saying it's not profound? Of course it is. Glastonbury, I mean, it's, you know, in terms of that, Left Field, obviously you've pioneered, you're a pillar of the Glastonbury experience. How are you feeling about, you know, because for me, when I knew it was going to get cancelled this year, but it being cancelled was something kind of, I don't know, I felt sad for a few hours, even if whether or not I went or not. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a bellwether, isn't it? If Glastonbury's going to happen, then everything's going to happen. Because it's so early in the calendar, it's a real sign to whether or not we're out of this. And I think for many of us who had tours cancelled this year, myself included, Glastonbury was the first thing we had on our diary that might happen. And so it not happening was, I mean, I don't think you could really say you were shocked by it, but you know, it was sad to hear it's not going to happen. So then now the next thing I've got is in October. I've got a tour in October. I'm hoping by then things will be under control and it'll be able to go ahead. But I feel we're kind of probably rock and roll is going to be the last people to come back because, you know, for my audience, who broadly speaking are kind of my age, the idea of standing in a dark room with 500 other people singing at the top of your voice for 2 hours, you can understand how they might think in a time of you know, confinement and pestilence that might not be a great idea. So I'm hoping the rollout of the vaccine will sort that out, but fingers crossed.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people missing dark rooms at Glastonbury. So in terms of talking about how you've coped during the pandemic, how have you been coping in the last?
Not too bad, actually. I mean, you know, I'm in a very fortunate situation. You know, I'm a worker from home when I'm not on the road, so I'm used to doing that. Being writing stuff, I really enjoy writing stuff. I've got into that quite a lot, writing stuff other than songs. I mean, so I've been doing a bit of that. I live on a beach, so I can't complain about that. We've got plenty of room to go and walk. It's a bit muddy at the moment, but getting there and getting back, but that's beautiful. The village shop delivers our groceries, so can't complain about that. But it's just having something to focus on. That's the thing that's hard, I think, being focused on getting the stuff done. So I've been doing stuff like clearing out my basement and my attic and working my way through, you know, none of the drawers in this house are safe from me coming and clearing them all out and sorting them all out. So by the end of it, I'll have everything in a shoebox, I think. So that's kind of something I've been doing, and I'm a bit of a family history buff on account of when my mum passed away 10 years ago. I kind of inherited this suitcase full of old photos and realised that nobody else in the family knew who these people were. My brother and his kids had no idea. So you can make a book on the internet with photos. So I sort of put together a photo book of all these pictures and, what my dad did during the war and stuff like that with photos. And my partner, who has a much more complicated family, people living abroad, people coming and going over a long period, a lot of mystery involved. She wanted me to do the same for her family. So over the last few months, I've been wading my way through that and talking to her siblings and her cousins and and it's been good for me because it's given me a project. It's given me something to do. When it will end, I don't know. But it's like putting together a mystery podcast. Mm-hmm. Passes the time, and of course, writing songs for a new album. I'm working on that as well, trying to work out how to make an album in these, sort of strange circumstances. But yeah, keep me busy.
You became this iconic singer under Thatcherism. How do you, looking back, if you compare, we've had a decade of Toryism now. What a decade!
Yeah.
How would you compare those governments?
I think what's missing now from the old days is ideology. Thatcher had an ideology. You knew what she stood for because it sort of inhabited everything she said and she did. You knew exactly where you stood with her. Not so with the Cameron, May, Johnson Tories. They don't seem to have anything to believe in, which is why Brexit was so important to them, because it gave them a kind of something to get wound up about. And now that's happened. They're moving on to what we refer to as culture wars, as a way of banging the drum for their notion of the way society should be run. So that's really what's different to me. It's much harder to pin the current lot down. They want to be loved. Thatcher never wanted to be loved. And much as it frustrates me to say it, she's probably the most radical of the sort of post 1970 prime ministers, and we haven't seen a Labour prime minister like that, as radical as that, which is a real pity.
One of the things you're really interested in is, I guess, identity, patriotism, and a lot of people on the left, they hear patriotism, they go, no, they think it's associated with lots of people, particularly if they think about English patriotism, with empire, with chauvinism, white, just exclusively white, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
Well, how some people that we have to deal with associate socialism with Stalinism. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter where you are on the left, you're a total communist and you want to overthrow capitalism, even if you're just asking for a little bit more social justice. Well, I think that's the mirror of the way the left look at patriotism. They define patriotism in its worst expressions. They define patriotism as purely as a chauvinistic nature. Now, we on the left know that there are lots of different types of socialism, and we are able to, see the nuances between democratic socialism and Christian socialism and, revolutionary socialism. Patriotism is the same, because I think ultimately, fundamentally, identity is a personal construct. You are who you say you are, and nobody telling you otherwise can say, I used to tour a black guy who was sold T-shirts on the England Half English tour, and we used to sit and have a beer after the show, and he used to shake his head and laugh about the idea of Englishness, because he, although he was born in London and he was to all extents and purposes English, he didn't identify as English. And I realized that there was no point in me trying to convince him, because it was really down to him and his perception of who he was. And I think he felt he was a European and a Londoner. That was what he identified as. And you have to respect that. I have to respect that in the end. So if identity is a personal construct, and the things that you love about your country and the things that you take pride in about your country also become a series of personal choices. So I would say that, we've heard the Labour Party bandy about the phrase progressive patriotism. Now, what does that mean? It certainly doesn't mean aping the the right, trying to gainsay the right by going on about how much we love the army and the Union Jack. I don't think there's nothing progressive in that particularly. I think we have to start by recognizing that the sense of patriotism that most of us think of when we think of patriotism is a particular type of patriotism. It's a chauvinistic patriotism. It's, the chauvinistic patriot identifies with, symbols like the flag, institutions like the army, and believes fundamentally that people should assimilate to their notion of what it means to be English, British, or whatever. The progressive patriot, on the other hand, really concentrates on the values that the country aspires to, values of tolerance and values of, a fair society. It also focuses on the progressive patriot also takes pride in justice and the way that the nation does or doesn't, when it fails to deliver justice, and also takes pride in the diversity of the nation. So these are two completely different ideas of a greater whole, because the chauvinistic patriot also believes in the nation's values, but doesn't really want to talk about that stuff. And they don't want to talk about justice either because they don't want to talk about where it's gone wrong. In some ways, I sometimes think the chauvinistic patriot is trying to gain self-confidence by bigging up their country, therefore bigging up themselves. Whereas the progressive patriot embraces their country, loves their country, but is willing to speak up when it does things that have gone wrong, So that they're two different threads. And it's not necessary for the Labour Party to follow just one. I read something that Tony Blair had said recently about, never being able to deal with patriotism unless you love the armed forces and you support the police. I don't buy that. I don't think there's just one monolithic idea of what patriotism is. I think we all bring to our sense of identity how we feel about the nation that we live in, the space that we share. Because fundamentally for the left, ultimately, this has to be about belonging rather than nationalism or patriotism. Are we capable of creating a society in which people feel they belong, people who are from diverse backgrounds? Some of them would be British, others would be from immigrant backgrounds. Can we create a society in which people feel they belong? And unless we're putting out our idea of what society should be like as a nation, then we're leaving it to the far right to define who does and who doesn't belong. And I think we've done that for too long. And that's why this issue, I think, is important.
I've had just a couple of things. I find it really interesting, the whole kind of thinking about English identity, because in terms of what is it, I suppose, because when I go abroad, I never feel more English for two reasons. I forgot to pack some PG tips and queuing. That's quite a British thing, I think. Yeah. But in terms of, I grew up in Stockport. I was born in Sheffield, but I grew up in Stockport, just near the town centre. And I live in London now.
Yeah.
Not far from the centre. And they couldn't be more different worlds. London feels, and I've lived it, I am a Londoner. I'm a plastic northerner at best. But London feels like a completely different country from where I grew up. Just the way people are, the kind of culture of London compared to the culture of Stockport. London is more familiar to me if I go to Paris or New York than it is to the rest of the country. And the other thing is, there's also this caricature equally of London where in the north, which is it's all posh and it's, and all the rest of it. And London's got some of the worst poverty in the country. Islington, where I live, like a cliche, 40% of kids grow up in poverty in Islington, and Islington is synonymous with Champagne Socialist. But that's what I mean. Isn't that where it becomes complicated? Because if we look at England itself, I was going to come on to something a bit more profound about history, about claiming bits of history and being proud of that history and how that could be patriotic, I suppose. But it's just the fact, it's just England itself is just so, London.
Well, if you can imagine, I was technically I was born in Essex, because Barking, where I come from, was in Essex till 1965. But that's a different argument altogether. But can you imagine what it's like for me to be in Stockport? Oh my God, they've got coal in the bath. Look at these whippets everywhere. Why are they all wearing cloth caps? The thing is, in that sort of different lives is true of any country. Look at Scotland. There's a highland and a lowland culture. And that's in a country of only 5 million people, smaller population than London. Look at Wales, even smaller population, and they have a Welsh-speaking area and a non-Welsh-speaking area. Every country has those differences in them. And I think they're not contradictions. They're part of a greater whole. And we have to be able to connect with those things on a level of space. This is the space we share with each other. Not race, not blood and soil, but space and how we live in that space and how we want that space to be. Surely that's what we're doing. That's why we're interested in politics, because we're interested in creating a better society for all. And you can't do that, I believe, unless you have some idea of the community and of the nation as well, because like it or lump it, nation states are still the way that you get stuff done. It would be great if we had, there is no nations and nobody cares about those things, and fine. But in pragmatic terms, that's how you get things done. And it's possible to, if you look at the Scottish National Party, to make a progressive case for nationalist politics. I'm always running into problems with people arguing about this issue. And in some ways, this is an example of the different types of nationalism in the same way there's different types of patriotism. Both the British National Party and the Scottish National Party are nationalist parties, but which is the true nationalist? Well, they're both nationalists because there's different, again, nationalism has different expressions of itself. And in the end, when what you're really talking about in Scotland is about a civic nationalism that's down to self-determination, it's about devolution, it's about giving people some agency over their lives, I think that's a positive kind of nationalism, because it rejects the ethnic nationalism of the British National Party, and I have to say the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party is becoming an ethnic nationalist party, as is the Republican Party in the United States of America.
I mean, it'd be interesting to talk about Scottish nationalism too, in that kind of civic patriotism, I suppose, or civic nationalism that's embraced. But do you think the thing with English patriotism, the reason often it's associated with being quite reactionary, is kind of twofold? Firstly, England's historic identity is of being conquerors. They conquered, obviously, Wales to begin. The Welsh kingdom as it was subjugated, and then obviously was the senior partner in the British Empire. I mean, Scotland, there is sometimes a revisionist history. Scotland is an oppressed country, which isn't true. Scotland was also up to its neck in empire, along with England.
Yeah.
But the two things are, firstly, it's the identity of being conquerors. And there's a difference between the nationalism of the oppressed, that is nations that have been subjugated by others, because often they have a progressive bent just because they are the oppressed fighting the oppressor. And the other is, this is an odd thing to say, but we had a premature revolution. So we had the English Revolution back in the 17th century, about a century and a half before the Bastille was stormed in France. And because of that, revolution is not core to our identity in the way it is in France. So French nationalism can often have, even though it was a conquering nation as well, a progressive bent in an easier way, because it's associated with rising up against injustice, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And for us, it's just so associated with empire and domination and oppressing people.
And never coming to terms with that, never dealing with the reality of what the empire was like, still teaching it as if it was a beneficial thing. All empires are about exploitation. That's the bottom line. That's what they're for. That's why the Romans come here. They didn't come here to build roads for us and give us wine. They come here because there were stuff that they needed, gold, copper, those kind of things. And they wanted to corner the market. So we should be teaching that to people and getting people to understand that. But the chauvinistic patriots are very, very protective of the British Empire because it gives them a sense of self-confidence. I mean, I did read somewhere they were talking to people about how why Johnson's still so popular, despite everything that's gone on in the last year. And once somebody did say, because he's not ashamed of the empire. And that's, that should still be an issue all these years later. Is rather unfortunate. I think you put your finger on it really with the English Revolution, having our revolution before the concept of fundamental individual rights had formed, 100 years before Tom Paine wrote The Rights of Man and Common Sense, we had our revolution. But if you look at that, what it was about, it was really a recommitment to something even earlier, which is Magna Carta. And the key aspect of Magna Carta that's still relevant to us today, and was the revolutionary idea then, is that no one is above the law. And that's what the Civil War was about. You know, that even the king would have to be held to account. And they ultimately held him to account in a rather extreme way by chopping off his head. But they did that because they felt that they had to, you know, in order to end the war, finish the war, they had to have they could have easily taken the king away and killed him somewhere on the quiet and showed his body and said, that's it, it's over. But they put him on trial. You know, they believed in accountability, the parliamentarians back in those days. And in some ways, that's our English tradition. That's the tradition of dissent around which we build our progressive patriotism, that thread of trying to hold supreme power to account, whether it's at Magna Carta, whether it's at the Battle of Naseby in the Civil War, whether it's the formation of the trade unions, the suffragettes, the welfare state trying to find a way to hold capitalism to account. That thread of accountability, I would argue, is a stronger tradition in our history than the tradition of the empire, because the empire does have a class dimension to it, I think. You know, it's almost as if Britishness is an imposition on top of Englishness, particularly the revolutionary Englishness, because if you know your history of the English Republic, those years when Cromwell was in charge, it was an incredibly radical place. There was all sorts of amazing stuff going on. You know, the diggers, the levelers are just the tip of the iceberg, and the establishment wanted to put the lid back on that, and that's what the Glorious Revolution was about. You know, that attempt to resolve the issue of how you hold the king to account again. In this case, James II. How do you hold the king to account without having another bloody civil war? And they managed to do it by having an agreement whereby Parliament became sovereign, the Crown became sovereign in Parliament. So these struggles for accountability throughout our history, I think that's the seedbed for our arguments for not only for a progressive patriotism, but for a culture of accountability that carries on to this day.
I mean, that is the issue, isn't it? Partly, it's that we haven't come to terms with our history in two different ways. In that, you know, I mentioned the English Revolution, which is not in any sense core to people's identity in this country. Lots of people don't really know much actually about the English Revolution, or at least don't see it as an English Revolution. They see it as a conflict, a internal conflict in many centuries ago. That has
a blip in a glorious history.
Historical collaboration. And so on the one hand, you know, you talk about this other history, the Chartists, the world's first great working class political movement. The levelers, of course, in the English Revolution, and the diggers, the levelers being proto-democrats, the diggers being proto-socialist, proto-communist even. And you know, the suffragettes, as you say, who were, you know, who were treated as secular heroes now, but in their time were reviled as terrorists, dragged to police demonstrations, thrown into dirty cells with tubes forced down their noses. And you talk about, you know, the welfare state, the NHS, all those sorts of things. So, but we don't have, you know, in the sense that those bits, the progressive bits of people struggling against injustice, we're not properly taught about. And equally, we're not taught properly about the horrors of empire. So actually, huge numbers of people in this country, the polling shows, feel proud of empire. They think it was a good thing, not something to be ashamed of. And that's the issue, isn't it? We don't truly understand ourselves because we don't know the bits of our history about people struggling against injustice and winning our rights. And we also don't know the evils committed by our rulers in other countries. Yeah,
we've never really had a reckoning for that. And our culture still has the trappings of imperialism. You know, those little bits of the map, those tiny little bits of the map that are still red. You know, the fact that we're still got that Gothic Parliament. I think the imagery of it is all incredibly imperial. The honours, you know, that you can still become a member of the Order of the British Empire. I mean, it's all around us, and we benefit from it still. You know, we benefit from the British Empire still. The very fact that most of the world's lingua franca is the English language is because of the British Empire, and we're still getting. I'm able to go on tour all around the world because of that. Whereas if I was a German speaker or a French speaker, I wouldn't be able to do that. So we're still benefiting from it, but we're never really recognizing that it was something that was a negative thing, and we need to be held to account for it. We need to look at what happened there and start to genuinely think about some form of reparations for some of those nations that we tore to bits.
I mean, where patriotism, I suppose a lot of people get nervy, is the way it's used to portray actually those struggling for a better sort of society as people who hate their own country. And I mean, I found this fascinating because if you look at the Daily Mail, which I do, part of my job, I sometimes do.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Thoroughly wash my hands with disinfectant afterwards, which is helpful during a pandemic. So
definitely.
But you think they hate loads of things about Britain. They hate the NHS, they hate the public sector, they hate trade unionists, they hate migrants, minorities. They historically obviously hated all sorts of the LGBT rainbow, particularly now the Tea Party. I mean, you look at but it's interesting, isn't it, how the left is often accused of hating its own country because they want to rid their own country of injustice, which I suppose you could term as a very patriotic act. But when it comes to the right, they hate. They always, the country's gone to the dogs is probably the most.
It's going to the dogs because people no longer uphold those old imperial values. It's going to the dogs because people who were formerly in nations that we ruled over are now in this country and wanting the same rights as us. I mean, the whole, the so-called culture wars that we're increasingly finding. I mean, Robert Jenrick last week talking about protecting statues. I mean, what's that if not trying to perpetuate the myth of imperialism? If Jenrick really wants to do something about saving sort of the Britain that people love, he should do something about the number of pubs that have closed over the last, not just in the pandemic, over the last 10 years. That's really what would make a difference to people. Some villages have their only community centre is their pub, but they're not interested in that because that's all left to the free market. And I think the wave of accountability that we've seen since over the last 10 years, since information has been digitized, is a real threat to those people who feel they're trying to protect that particular chauvinistic idea of what it means to be British or American, for that matter. In many ways, Make America Great is a similar sensibility to let's run up the Union Jack and salute the British Empire. The irony being that in trying to deliver that by facilitating Brexit, the Tories may also break up the United Kingdom. That's the terrible irony for them. And in that, the break up of the United Kingdom, which I'm very much in favour of, we on the left will have to come up with some kind of version of English identity in order to be able to talk to people. If we just keep backing away, and the Scots do get the self-determination that I believe they deserve, and perhaps the Northern Irish come to a different relationship with the Irish Republic, then we really are gonna have to think about who we are. And I don't think that's such a terrible thing, because the obvious way to address that would be to give England political visibility. If you're Scottish or you're Welsh or Northern Irish for that matter, if you're trying to get your head around what that means, you've got in the National Assembly or Parliament, you've got an idea of what the country looks like and who you are. There's a Museum of Scotland, there's a Museum of Wales, there's no Museum of England. If you want to know what's going on in England, you've got to go in the British Museum, and the Anglo-Saxons are in between the Phoenicians and the Romans and the medieval Borgias and all that stuff. You've got to kind of find it. So what we should be talking about, and I'm disappointed that the New Labour leadership haven't grasped this particular opportunity. We need to be talking about devolving power into England and probably into the English regions to bring power closer to people. Because I think that we've seen through the pandemic how centralized government doesn't help in a situation like this. You need people on the ground with local knowledge to deal with local people in a way that's sympathetic to their environment. And we've kind of lost that. We live in one of the most centralized nations in Europe, in the UK, and that needs to change. And I think the last few elections have been kind of anti-Westminster results. The Brexit was an anti-Westminster vote. The couple of elections that have left no majority, that's not supposed to happen under first past the post. Well, it's happened because people are no longer happy with the way politics is done in Westminster. So that kind of needs to change. And devolution has been Labour's issue. They're the party of devolution. Why they don't grasp that and start talking about that, start going out there and saying this is the change we want to bring. I don't understand why they don't do that.
I do think it is fascinating how the Tories and their cheerleaders will portray the toppling of statues celebrating slavers who are responsible partly for the deaths of thousands and thousands of people and some of the worst horrors in human history, whilst to deflect attention from the vandalism of austerity, of allowing, the cultural assets, if you like, whether it be libraries and so on, whether it be the decimation of education.
Yeah. If you're interested in history, a library is quite a valuable asset, isn't it? You'd think, rather than a statue. But it's all distraction. It's the cancel culture thing. It's just the latest in a long line. Stretches back to political correctness, and all of it has the same. As the same target, which is to police the limits of social change, to stop people who are demanding their rights, who are demanding accountability, to distract them from what they're doing by trying to turn the focus of their anger into a victim. The self-victimization, the whole cancel culture thing. Why are you beating me up? And I don't agree with those people who say we shouldn't engage in a culture war. We shouldn't engage in these arguments, because I think very often they are defenses of bigotry, and we can't allow people to give a free pass just because we think it's something that the Tories are doing on purpose to distract it. We can't allow them to put out those ideas and them to be validated by us not challenging them. And I think that the younger generation understand that. To me, the fact that the film of George Floyd being murdered by those policemen, the footage that we're all familiar with, was shot by a 14-year-old on her phone. Who's done the most for ordinary working people in the last year? It's Marcus Rashford. He's 21. Young people, rather than obsessing about freedom of speech and being able to say what they want to say whenever they want to say it to whoever they want to say it to, they're more interested in accountability. And I find great encouragement in that. The huge political movements of this century, Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, Me Too, although they're diverse in their focus, they're all about the same thing. They're all about accountability. And I think we on the left, that's our bloody issue, isn't it? I mean, what is socialism about if it's not about holding capitalism to account, holding those in power to account in the workplace, in the economy? It's got to be about that, hasn't it? It's got to be the response to neoliberalism that says the free market has all the answers and we can't mess with it. We've just got to let the market do whatever it wants to do. We've got to have a line that we no longer cross. And I believe that line should be accountability on all levels.
Before I ask you one other question about the culture war, and also I want to know about your thoughts about Labour right now. We're two white guys, as everyone can see. And a lot of people of colour feel uncomfortable with any talk of patriotism because of a concern that it ends up providing, if we even talk about progressive patriotism, a kind of a progressive coating of something which is always about who or what is English and what is not English and who is English. And that's always a slippery slope because by definition, as soon as people start talking about what is English identity and therefore it encourages people to think what isn't English, that can encourage people to go down a very a horrifying path of thinking, well, actually, this is an other which isn't genuinely English, and that's always minorities.
It depends who you let define who is and who isn't English, isn't it? I mean, if you're looking for examples of Englishness, which are hard to find, what it is today to be English, look at our national sports teams. They're diverse. They're not all just white guys or white women. They're diverse teams. And again, that's why I think it has to come back to being about belonging rather than about nationality and blood and soil. In some ways, we're playing to the rights definition there. I saw a program, it must be 20 years ago now, on BBC about they followed the mitochondrial DNA of British, Afro-Caribbean British citizens to find something about their ancestry, and they went back to where there was. And one of the women was, although her parents were from the Caribbean, she identified as an African to the extent that she wore African clothes and taught in schools in Bristol to kids, African culture to school kids. And they found her blood relatives on an island off the west coast of Africa. It was really emotional, actually. I took her back to the village, and it was very, very emotional. And I felt it when she sat on the hill above the village. She's going to walk down into this village and meet her blood relatives. I mean, it made me tingle. It makes me tingle even now talking about it. And you can see it in her face. She went down there. She met with them and everything. And at the end of the documentary, she said into the camera, "Now I know where I belong." And then she got on a helicopter and she went back to Bristol. And I'm like, wait. All that stuff, you've seen all that, you've been to that place, you identify with that, yet you belong in Bristol with those people. And I think fundamentally belonging is a much stronger bond in societal terms and in cultural terms and in community terms. And that's what we've got to be talking about. We've got to be talking about people belonging in this space. And I think anybody who's, come from outside of the UK has an opportunity to become part of that UK, because we be part of that belonging, because we've always been a nation of immigrants. There's no other racial type that I know that has a hyphen in their racial type name, Anglo-Saxon. I mean, what does that tell you about our history? So we need to be talking more about that diversity as progressive patriots. Diversity needs to be something that we celebrate. St. George, our patron saint from the Lebanon, what's he doing here? How did he end up here? These kind of aspects of our history, we need to be talking about these things. And we will have to find some common ground with people of color. In their terminology, we'll have to make a space for them that won't be exactly the same space that we feel they should inhabit, but hopefully it'll be a space that they feel comfortable in bringing their kids up in, because this is really what it's about. And if we don't, as I say, the Daily Mail will do this, because it's in their interest to define who does and who doesn't belong in the narrowest way possible. So it's in all our interest to find a way to come to terms with that sense of belonging that deals with the space called England. Difficult though it will be, painful though it will be. Although I'll be honest with you, I did a workshop once at WOMAD about Englishness, and it almost ended up in a fist fight. People were so angry with the idea of Englishness. And after it all calmed down at the end, there was, we were chatting with people in the audience and it calmed down. And a German guy came up to me and said, "Billy, that was really, really good. And if you think you've got problems trying to come to terms with the past, you should come to Germany and have this conversation." So we're not alone in this. It's not something that we ourselves are particularly prone to, the English. It's something that all nations with a history, particularly with an imperial history, have to come to terms with. And whether we like it or not, it's an issue that's going to be on the agenda, because that's the way the Conservative Party are going. That's the way the Tory press are going. And we have to do more than just sit there with the Union Jack in the background when we make a video for the TV,
I mean, it is true.
I see you've got a lovely light in your background to see how modern you are. You've put that there specifically for me to say how
it's really positive. Well, can turn it on by remote control. It's really
far out. I've just got a mandolin and a picture of Yuri Gagarin.
It's a bloody good picture of Yuri Gagarin.
It's a 1960s art. It's a 1960s pop art thing that a friend of mine made at college in the 60s.
You Soviet fifth columnist.
It's pop art. 60s.
60s, it is 60s. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's true. I mean, Scottish civic nationalism has managed to, it doesn't have that kind of drenched in whiteness in the same way that has been constructed in England. And that, I think, if we look at the Scottish National Party, people of colour are actually very central to that political project. Not as much as it should be, but it's still notable. Just on another thing, just a couple of the questions. The culture war, which you mentioned, isn't it basically, it's become a generational war, hasn't it? Basically, and a big caveat here, my mum, for example, she's a 69-year-old, brought me up to abhor racism, support LGBTQ rights, support, feminism very much core to her identity and the family's identity. But and there are lots of other older people like that. Important caveat. Nonetheless, statistically, if you look at the polling, it's just factually the case that if you're over 65, you are far more likely to have a negative view of immigration, of multiculturalism, of feminism, of LGBTQ rights. And if you are younger, particularly a millennial or Zoomers who are already mocking my generation, the millennials, I'm an older millennial, then far more likely as an article of faith, LGBTQ rights, anti-racism, feminism, the climate emergency, which has become a cultural war. And again, attitudes towards climate, the polling's very clear. Obviously, there were older people who were very key to Extinction Rebellion, actually. Nonetheless, there's a generational divide. This has become a war of generations. And in 1983, when Labour got hammered by the Tories, the young voted for Margaret Thatcher. She won the under 25s. And actually, the gap in age groups politically is a relatively new phenomenon. And the young overwhelmingly vote for the Labour Party, and older people overwhelmingly vote for the Conservatives. That's partly to do with a huge part of it. Younger people, housing crisis, jobs crisis, living standards crisis, services slash, whilst older people, rightly, triple lock protected, home ownership's gone up. So it's partly an economic thing.
Yeah.
It is, this culture war is a war of generations. What's the way out of that one then?
Well, it looks like a war of generations, doesn't it? But that's because it's been stripped of all its ideological meaning. When Thatcher was elected in 79, 83, there was still a visible class divide there. There was still a kind of a decision made by people who want a particular kind of politics. I think that now that's broken down to such an extent that we end up with a Conservative Party that are relying on a narrow idea like Brexit to try and win votes, and it's been very successful for them. That's the frightening thing, that idea that it was better before we were in the European Union, that we can go back to that. I mean, the reality of that is starting to bite people in the arse now. People who voted for Brexit expecting to go everything to turn back how it was before, and it hasn't done that. The world's moved on. I think really we have to recognize that one of the reasons why young people are so more radicalized is because they have the opportunity now to access more information about things that they didn't before. They're not relying on the mainstream media to edit what they're seeing. They can find it for themselves, and they can themselves speak. I've always thought, Owen, if it hadn't been for social media, in order to get your ideas out, you would have had to do my job, because when I was 19, if I had views about the world, there was only one medium available to me, and that was to learn to play guitar, write songs, and do gigs. That was the only way I was going to get my voice heard. There was no other way. Of course, now there's, myriad opportunities for a 19-year-old to have their view expressed. So as a result of that, there's fewer topical songwriters, you may have noticed, but there are more people that get involved in the debate. And I think that's why we can see young people now, they're visible in a way that they weren't visible in politics in the 1980s. That's why something like Red Wedge had to be based around music rather than around just straightforwardly around empowering young people, coming from young people. We had the medium of music through which to express all of our emotions. It's the only medium we had, so it had to encapsulate everything, and politics was part of that mix.
Finally, Labour under Keir Starmer. What are your thoughts?
Well, as Chairman Mao said about the French Revolution, it's a bit early to tell, isn't it? I don't really think they've managed to do anything except, I suppose, what you might say, start to try and paper over the cracks that appeared in the party during the Corbyn years, what they're going to stand on the next election, what their defining issue is going to be. I don't think that's yet clear, and I'd like to see it something, obviously something radical, but also something that takes its own agenda, it's Labour's agenda, rather than riffing off the Tories' agenda as a response to whatever the Tories are going to come up with in a post-Brexit, post-pandemic world. So, yeah, you have to understand I'm a glass half full person, Owen. I think to be a socialist, you have to believe in humanity. You have to be someone who manages, tough though it is, to keep their cynicism in check. We're all vulnerable to it, particularly as we get older. We're vulnerable to cynicism, me as much as anybody else. But I do my best to fight against that. I find activism the best antidote to cynicism. But I'm also in an industry that our kind of the currency of what we do in the music industry, all of us making music, is empathy. And so consequently, you've got to, in order to be able to do that, you've got to believe in people. You've got to believe that people are willing to make a connection with what you're putting out there. So I tend towards the glass half full kind of thing, and that's where I am still with Starmer's Labour.
Billy, what an absolute gent. And I love it because you are just. It is. I have to say, just finally, your optimism is very infectious, and we need that. We need more optimism, less COVID.
Yeah, so long as it doesn't slide into romantic optimism. Again, in pop music, it's a very dangerous thing. A bit too much romance. You've got to leaven it with some pragmatism, and recognize that music can't change the world. It can't. It doesn't have agency. Ultimately, and trust me, I mean, people get really pissed off when I say music can't change the world. But if anybody has had a go at doing that, I think the experience I've had, I understand music can't change the world, but what it can do and why it's worth trying is it can change people's perception of the world. So you have an opportunity to send people away, not only because of what you've said and what you've sung at the gig, but you've allowed people to stand among a crowd of maybe, 200, 300 people and they're all singing There Is Power in the Union. And they take some solidarity home from that. They make them feel like they're not alone. That's the great thing that music does, not political music, any music. It makes you feel like you're not alone. When you feel like someone's been reading your mail when they wrote a song. That kind of empathy is really, really important to what we do. So I'm trying to put that out every night, because when the audience respond in the way they do to my songs, particularly the political ones, it kind of charges up my activism. It charges up my sense of optimism. And I want the audience to go home with that same feeling. I don't want them to go home thinking, it's all over, we've blown it, when sometimes we have. Sometimes we've totally blown it, and we have to accept that. But what do we, how do we go on? In the end, it's got to be about people and about, potential and living in a world of possibilities. And these are, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. We come, the Americans now living in a world of possibilities. We just have to work really hard to make those possibilities into realities.
And I'd say my test of whether or not someone's a sociopath is in the final scene of Pride, which is about how LGBTQ activists showed solidarity with the miners, lesbian, gays, support the miners. As your rendition of Power in the Union comes on, every time I watch it, weep like a small.
Yeah.
Very moving. But Billy,
I had the same thing. I had the same thing when I went to see it. When it first came out, and I knew the song was in at the end there. I knew it was in there somewhere. But also, Mark, the main character in the movie, he worked with Red Wedge, so I knew him as well. And when they started flashing up what happened to everybody and where they went, that's really what got me, because Mark was the first person I knew who died of AIDS, and I knew what was coming. And that really, more than the Power in the Union and the colliery band they put on it as well, That was what really got me to swell up at the end there. But yeah. That's the thing about music. And it's really good to have something that can change your mood. That's not chemical that you're putting in your body. To be able to feel something and have that feeling enhanced by music, whether it's melancholy or joy or whatever. That's a really good skill to have. That's why people believe that music can change the world, because it can change your mood. It can have that powerful effect on you in a way so few things can. And that's why people believe it can change the world. They want to believe that. And I'll be honest with you, there's no harm in trying. It's always worth having a go. But in the long run, you've got to throw the responsibility back on the audience and send them home saying, if you want to change the world, that's your responsibility. I'm gone tomorrow. I'm in another place. You're still here to deal with whatever you've got to deal with in this place. All I've done is brought you together and gave you a bit of a vibe. And, you've got to take that away with you and do something with it. Because that's what happened to me at Rock Against Racism. That's how I was politicized. I took that away, that spark away, and I built my political worldview on that.
Billy, what an honor.
Thanks, mate. It's been fun.
We're never going to succeed in radicalizing politics and doing what must be done on behalf of the many if we do not challenge the dominance of the establishment media with our own media. So support Owen Jones' team on Patreon.